The tray in my hands was heavier than it should have been. Just deviled eggs, just paper napkins folded into triangles, but my arms were shaking by the time I set it down on the buffet table, because I had heard what he said through the kitchen doorway, and I hadn't moved, and I hadn't dropped a single egg. I didn't cry. I just stood there, listening to my stepson tell a room full of people who I was, and who I wasn't. She's not really family, he'd said. Easy, almost bored, the way you'd correct someone about a name on a mailbox. She just married my dad. 22 years. 22 years of birthdays and stitches in knees, and a wedding dress I hemmed myself at midnight because the seamstress canceled. And I was reduced to a clerical error in front of people holding plastic cups of lemonade. I set the tray down straight. I smoothed the tablecloth with the flat of my hand. And I smiled at the next person who came through that kitchen door, because that is what I have always done. I have always been the one who keeps the room calm. But calm is not the same as forgetting. And I did not forget one word of it. My name is Eleanor. I am 68 years old. And for 31 years I taught second grade at the same elementary school 2 towns over. The kind of job where you learn to read a room of small, frightened people and figure out exactly what they need before they know how to ask for it. I retired 6 years ago. My husband, Walter, died 4 years ago this October, and if you are picturing a fragile woman folding napkins in some drafty house, waiting for her family to decide whether she still counts, you have the wrong picture entirely. I was not born into this family. I married into it. Walter had a son from his first marriage, Daniel, who was 9 years old when I met him, and I raised that boy through braces and a broken collarbone, and a first heartbreak that I sat up with him for until 2 in the morning. I never once tried to replace his mother, who passed when he was small. I only tried to make sure he had somebody standing in the doorway of every hard night. I thought that counted for something. I thought 22 years of showing up counted for something. I found out at that barbecue, in front of Daniel's neighbors and his wife Michelle's book club friends, and his own 11-year-old daughter, Sophie, exactly how much it counted. Not really family. For words, delivered so casually he probably forgot he'd said them by the time he reached for another beer. I want to tell you what I did next. But first I need you to understand who I was before any of this started, because what I did wasn't rage. It was arithmetic. And I have always been very good at arithmetic. Walter and I built a life on a foundation nobody could see, which is exactly how I like my foundations. He was an accountant, careful with paper the way some men are careful with tools, and I learned from him without ever meaning to. I learned that the person who keeps the documents is the person who keeps the truth. I learned that a marriage is not just a feeling, it is also a filing cabinet. And if you love someone properly, you make sure that filing cabinet is in order before you ever need it. We were married in the backyard of this same house, the one Daniel grew up finishing in, the one I still live in. Walter used to say I ran that house like it was a second classroom. Everyone fed, everyone accounted for, nobody left standing in the cold. I taught Daniel to tie a necktie for his 8th grade dance. I sat in a folding chair for 11 years of Little League games in weather that would embarrass most people into staying home. When Daniel married Michelle, I paid for the flowers myself because his own savings had gone into the ring, and I never once mentioned it, not to him, not to anyone, not even to Walter, because that isn't the kind of love that keeps a ledger out loud. But I do keep a ledger. Quietly. I always have. Tuesday came gray and steady, 3 days after that barbecue, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, and I thought about the exact tone of Daniel's voice when he'd said it. Not cruel. That was the thing that stayed with me longest. Not cruel at all. Just certain. Like a man reading a label off a can. The Christmas of 2017 was the first time I really noticed it, though I didn't call it anything back then. Walter was already sick that year, thin in a way that frightened me every time he stood up from the table. And Daniel came for exactly 90 minutes, opened his gifts, and left before dessert because Michelle said the roads might ice. I remember standing at the sink that night, washing dishes alone, and hearing Walter's voice behind me. He gets that from his mother, he said, like an apology. I didn't answer because it wasn't my place to answer, or so I believed then. The summer of 2019 was the day I overheard Michelle on the porch, telling her sister on the phone that it was sweet in a way, that Eleanor still thought of herself as part of the planning, When I had spent that entire week organizing Walter's 70th birthday party, the guest list, the caterer, the tent rental, while Daniel and Michelle contributed a card. Sweet. In a way. As though I were a well-meaning volunteer at an event that was never mine to plan, rather than the woman who had built the life the party was celebrating. The spring after Walter's funeral, when Daniel came to help me sort through Dad's things, and I found 3 of Walter's watches missing from the dresser 2 days later, and when I gently asked, Daniel told me, not unkindly, that Dad probably wanted me to have those, since I'm his actual son. Actual son. As though I had been an understudy in my own marriage. And then this January, the night I overheard Daniel on the phone in my own hallway, telling someone from his office that his father's estate was basically settled, and that the house situation would work itself out eventually, once things naturally change. I stood in that hallway with a laundry basket against my hip, and I understood, for the first time with real clarity, that my stepson was waiting for me to die. Each of those moments, on its own, could be explained away. Grief makes people clumsy. Money makes people strange. I told myself that for years, because that is what women of my generation were taught to do: absorb the strangeness, soften the account, protect the peace. But 4 data points in a row are not an accident. 4 data points in a row are a pattern, and I had spent 31 years teaching children how to recognize patterns before they even had a word for what they were seeing. That wasn't even the worst thing the 2 of them were hiding that year. I promise you we are going to get there. 2 weeks after the barbecue, I was in the grocery store on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the cereal aisle of all places, when I heard Michelle's voice around the corner, low and quick, the way people talk when they think a store full of strangers grants them privacy. She was talking to her sister again. And what she said stopped me cold. One hand still resting on a box of oatmeal I never bought. Once Eleanor's out of the picture, she said, the house goes to Daniel outright. That's how his dad's will reads. She just gets to live there until, well, until. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I want you to understand something about the woman I was in that aisle. I did not gasp. I did not drop my basket. I stood very still. The way I used to stand at the front of my classroom when a child said something so honest and so devastating that the whole room went quiet, waiting to see how the teacher would respond. I did not respond. Not there. I finished my shopping. I paid for my groceries. I drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, because I needed the air on my face to remind myself I was still a person and not a line item. Here is where I have to slow down and tell you something true, because up until that point in my life, I believed, the way you believe the sun will rise, that this house was mine. Walter and I bought it together, the year before Daniel was born to his first wife. I had lived in it for 39 years. I had repainted every room in it twice. I had buried a dog in the yard behind the roses. And I was standing in a cereal aisle discovering that, according to what my daughter-in-law believed, I was a temporary condition, a holding pattern between Walter's death and Daniel's inheritance. That night I didn't sleep so much as I lay very still and did math in the dark. I thought about every document Walter had ever shown me, every conversation we'd had in the last 2 years of his life when he knew, and I knew, that his time was short, and he had wanted to make sure, his words, that I would never have to ask anyone for anything. I thought about the specific, careful way he had said that, sitting up in our bed with a legal pad on his knees, 3 months before he died. And then I remembered the letter. I want you to sit with me in that stillness for a moment, because I sat in it for hours. Not moving. Not turning on a light. Just remembering my husband's voice, low and steady, telling me something I had folded away in the part of my mind reserved for things too painful to look at directly. Grief does that. It buries even the useful things. The letter was in the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, underneath a stack of quilts I hadn't touched since the funeral, because grief has its own geography and I had simply never had the strength to go digging through that particular drawer of my own house. I found it that same night, at nearly 2 a.m, in an envelope with my name written on it in Walter's handwriting, the same handwriting that used to leave notes on the refrigerator. Buy milk. Pick up dry cleaning. I love you more than the dishes I left in the sink. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I read it twice before I let myself understand what it meant. He'd written it 8 months before he died, back when the pain medication still let him have clear afternoons. And in it, in his own words, in language so plain and so careful that I could hear him saying it out loud. My husband told me that he had restructured the deed on the house the year before, moving it fully into my name and only my name, separate from the rest of the estate, because, and this is the line I have read so many times now that I could recite it in my sleep, a man's estate should honor the person who actually built the life inside it, not just the name that happens to share his blood. He knew. My God, he knew exactly what his son was capable of believing about me, and he had built a wall around me before he ever had to watch me stand inside it. If you have ever sat alone in a quiet house at 2 in the morning holding proof that someone loved you more carefully than you ever understood while they were alive, you know exactly what I mean by that particular kind of grief. It arrives disguised as relief, and it knocks the wind out of you just the same. Stay with me, because this is where the story turns. The letter told me 2 things. It told me the house was mine outright, no waiting period, no until. And it told me where to find the paperwork that proved it. A folder, in Walter's old office downstairs, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet he kept locked, behind a stack of tax returns going back to 1994, because my husband was an accountant to the very last habit of his life. I went downstairs in my robe at 2 in the morning, and I found that folder exactly where he said it would be. A deed, transferred and recorded, dated 14 months before he died. A letter from his estate attorney confirming the transfer was separate from the will Daniel believed governed everything. And a second document I hadn't expected. A home equity line of credit Walter had opened in the last year of his life, in my name, sitting untouched, worth more than either of us had ever spent in a single year of marriage. He had built me a floor to stand on, quietly, the way he built everything, and he had never once mentioned it, because he didn't want me spending his final months thinking about money instead of him. I sat on that office floor and I cried finally, not for the barbecue, not for Michelle's phone call, but for my husband, who had loved me so precisely that even his silence had been a kind of protection. By Friday morning, I had made an appointment. The office of Walter's old attorney, a woman named Carol Ashby who had known us both for 11 years, smelled like coffee and old carpet, and she did not waste a single word on me. I wondered when you'd come in, she said, before I'd even finished sitting down. Walter told me you would. Eventually. He said you'd need time to be ready to use it. She confirmed everything the letter said, in sentences with no fat on them at all. The deed was clean. The helic was active and fully mine to draw against. And, this she told me almost as an afterthought, sliding a single page across the desk. Walter had also, 18 months before his death, quietly removed Daniel as a co-signer on 2 shared accounts Daniel didn't know he'd ever been removed from. Accounts Daniel had been assuming, for over a year now, still existed in his name. He was protecting you from something specific, Carol said, watching my face carefully. Did he ever tell you why? I thought about the watches. I thought about actual son. I thought about a hallway phone call about a house situation working itself out. I think I'm starting to understand why, I said. Carol nodded slowly. The way a doctor nods at a diagnosis, she suspected all along. Then let's talk about what you'd like to do next, Eleanor. Because legally, you have more room to move than most people ever get. The only question is how much of it you want to use. I told her everything. Not with anger. With the calm, itemized clarity of a woman finally allowed to speak a truth she'd been carrying quietly for years. And when I finished, Carol closed the folder, folded her hands on top of it, and said the words I had been waiting my whole widowhood to hear from someone whose job was simply to tell me the truth. Eleanor, she said, I've been waiting for this call. You are entirely within your rights. And frankly, I'm proud of you for finally making it. I want to be very clear with you about what I decided to do, because I did not decide to destroy anyone. I decided to stop protecting people who had never once protected me. Tuesday, I listed the house. My house, the one with my name and only my name on the deed, with a realtor I trusted, not because I intended to sell it immediately, but because a listed home cannot be quietly waited out by someone counting on inheriting it. A listing is a locked door with a very public sign on it. Wednesday, I changed the locks. Not out of spite, out of simple, sensible logic. Daniel had a key from a decade ago. Back when he used to check on the house while Walter and I traveled. He had never returned it. I had never asked for it back. The way you never ask for the return of things you assume will always be freely given. That assumption, I realized, had been doing quite a lot of unpaid labor on Daniel's behalf. Thursday, I called the bank and drew a modest, careful sum against the hellic Walter left me. Enough to finally take the kitchen renovation I'd wanted for a decade. The one Walter and I always said we'd get to eventually. I hired the contractor that same week. Friday, I sat down with Carol one more time and signed the paperwork to remove Daniel entirely as any kind of secondary contact or emergency authority on my accounts, replacing him, at Carol's gentle suggestion, with my late sister's daughter, a thoughtful young woman named Priya who had sent me a card every single year on the anniversary of Walter's death without ever once being asked to. And then I waited, because a woman who has spent 31 years managing a classroom knows that consequences do not need to be delivered. They only need to be allowed to arrive. Daniel's first voicemail came Saturday morning at 8:15. His voice was light, almost amused. "Hey Eleanor, saw the house is listed. Must be a mix-up with the realtor's site, give me a call." Daniel again, 11:40 that same morning, less light this time. "Okay," I called the number on the listing, and they confirmed it's real. "So, what is going on? Call me back." Michelle, 1:05 in the afternoon. A text this time, 3 exclamation points doing the work her voice usually did. "Eleanor, please call Daniel, he's very upset. We don't understand what's happening." Daniel, 3:30, his voice tighter now, the amusement fully gone. "I tried my key at the house and it didn't work. Did you change the locks? Eleanor, call me. This isn't funny." Daniel, 6:50 that evening. "I talked to the bank. They said I'm not on any of Dad's accounts anymore." "I'm not. What did you do?" Michelle, 7:15. "We are trying to be understanding here, but you are scaring Sophie, and honestly this behavior is a little concerning for someone your age. Eleanor, please just talk to us." Someone your age. I listened to that one twice. Daniel's brother-in-law, a man I'd met exactly 4 times, left a voicemail at 8:40 that I still don't fully understand the purpose of, something about keeping things civil for the family's sake, from a man who was not, by any definition Daniel himself had offered me 3 weeks earlier, actually family at all. 9 voicemails by Sunday night. 11 texts. 1 furious email from Michelle with the subject line, "We need to talk about the house," as though the house had ever, for one single day, belonged to the plural pronoun she was using. I let every single one of them sit unanswered until Monday morning, and then I called Daniel back myself, my voice as level and unhurried as it had ever been in front of a classroom of 26 7-year-olds on their worst behavior day. "I got your messages," I said. "I think we should talk in person. Sunday. My house. Bring Michelle." He didn't ask why. I think, somewhere underneath the panic, he already knew. They arrived that Sunday at exactly 2 o'clock, which told me something all on its own. Daniel had never once in 22 years arrived anywhere on time unless he was frightened. Michelle stood a half step behind him on the porch, arms crossed over a cardigan she clearly hadn't chosen for warmth. Sophie was with them, which I hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, and which changed the whole shape of what I was willing to say out loud in that room. I let them in. I offered coffee. Daniel declined it in a voice too fast to be polite. "What is going on?" he said. Not really a question, more of a demand dressed up as one. "The locks. The listing. My accounts. Eleanor, this is not okay. How much rent have you paid me?" I asked. Not sharp. Just level. A question, not an accusation, though I watched it land like one. He blinked. "What? I don't. That's not what this is about. How many mortgage payments have you made on this house?" I continued. "How many years have you spent maintaining it, or insuring it, or paying the taxes on it?" "Eleanor, I'm his son. You told a backyard full of people 3 weeks ago that I'm not really family," I said. "I'd like to understand which one of those 2 things is true, Daniel. Because you don't seem to be able to have both." Michelle stepped forward then, her voice pitched high and fast, the way people talk when they are more frightened of being caught than of being wrong. "We were just thinking ahead. For the family. For Sophie's future. We didn't mean it like it sounded." You were thinking ahead to my death, I said. In my own hallway. On the phone. While I was still standing in my own house. Nobody spoke for a moment. Sophie, 11 years old, sat very still on the arm of the sofa, watching her father with an expression I recognized instantly from 31 years of classrooms. The look of a child doing careful, silent arithmetic of her own. You've got to understand, Daniel said, and his voice cracked slightly. This is a lot. You completely locked me out. Of everything. Without any warning. I gave you 22 years of warning, I said. I just didn't call it that at the time. He sat down heavily in the chair by the window, the one that used to be his father's, and for a moment he looked less like a grown man defending himself, and more like the 9-year-old boy I met at a school pickup line, uncertain whether the new woman in his father's life was there to stay. I'm sorry, he said finally. About what I said at the barbecue. I shouldn't have said that. You're sorry I heard it, I said gently. That's not quite the same thing as being sorry you said it. Apologies that come in the wrong order aren't apologies, Daniel. They're negotiations. He didn't argue with that. I think for the first time in a long while, he understood exactly what I meant. I told them, then, calmly and completely, what the deed said. What the letter said. What Walter had known and planned for, and protected, long before either of them had any idea he was doing it. I watched something shift in Daniel's face as I spoke. Not defeat exactly, something closer to recognition. The particular grief of a man realizing his father had seen him more clearly than he'd ever let himself be seen. I did not soften everything. I told them the house would stay listed until I decided otherwise. And that decision was entirely mine to make on my own schedule, not theirs. I told them the accounts would remain as they now were. I told Michelle, as gently as I could manage, that I would not be attending any more gatherings where my presence in this family was treated as a matter of ongoing debate. But I also did one more thing, because a woman who wins by being loud has already lost the only kind of victory worth having. I looked at Sophie, who had not said one word the entire time, and I told her that none of what was happening was because of her, and that my door, this door, the one her father had once had a key to, would always be open to her on her own, whenever she wanted to come sit in my kitchen and talk about nothing at all. I told her there was a trust her grandfather had set up for her years ago, one Daniel and Michelle knew nothing about, that I intended to keep exactly as Walter had built it, untouched by any of this. Sophie cried a little at that. So I confessed, did I? 3 weeks later came, and the house was still listed, though I had not accepted a single offer, because I have learned that having the door open is sometimes worth more than actually walking through it. The kitchen renovation was finished, a bright, warm room now, the kind Walter always said I deserved and never quite got around to giving me. A letter arrived from Daniel that fall, handwritten. No return favors requested inside it, no defense of the barbecue or the phone call, or the year he'd spent quietly waiting me out. Just an apology, in the right order this time, about the harm itself and not the consequences of getting caught causing it. I did not write back right away. I put the letter in the drawer of my desk instead of the trash, which felt, to me, like the correct amount of forgiveness for a first attempt. Sophie started coming by on Thursdays after school, just the two of us, cocoa in the fall and lemonade once summer came back around. And somewhere in there I stopped thinking of this as revenge at all, and started thinking of it as something much simpler. Repair. The kind that happens slowly, on your own terms, in a kitchen you finally finished the way you always wanted. I still have Walter's letter. I keep it now not in the cedar chest but on the small desk in my new kitchen, where I can see it every morning with my coffee. I read it sometimes, not because I need reminding of what it says, but because I like hearing his voice again, even folded into paper, telling me that he saw exactly who I was the whole time, even when I doubted it myself. I wrote one line in my own notebook the night everything finally settled, and I still think it's the truest thing I've said in 4 years of being a widow. Family is not a word anyone else gets to hand you or take away. It is a debt someone pays, quietly, for as long as it takes, whether or not anybody's watching. I paid mine for 22 years. And in the end, so did Walter, one last time, from beyond it. That night, for the first time since the barbecue, I slept without the television murmuring in the next room just to fill the silence. I slept in a house with my name on the deed, in sheets I'd bought myself, in a kitchen finally finished the way I always wanted it. And I slept the way a woman sleeps when she finally stops asking permission to belong somewhere she already does.